Ok, boa tarde a todos novamente. Let's go. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the seminar. Our keynote speaker for this session is Professor Luis Bettencourt, who is Professor of Complex Systems at the Santa Fe Institute and a scientist at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Professor Bettencourt has worked extensively on cities and urbanization. His research has emphasized the creation of new interdisciplinary syntheses to describe cities in quantitative and predictive ways, informed by the growing availability of empirical data worldwide. So, Professor Bettencourt, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Obrigado, Bernardo. Eu falo português, se quiserem fazer perguntas depois mais tarde em português, não há problema, se bem que seja português do outro lado do Atlântico, mas darei então a palestra em inglês. Thank you, Bernardo. Hello over there. So, I don't know how this thing is going to work very well with the microphone, but let me try anyway and stay sitting now. So my talk will be mostly, can you hear me okay in the back? I hear echo. Is it okay? Okay, good. So my presentation will be about cities as complex objects, was the title of the chapter. I'll be talking about cities as complex systems. There's no big difference, but they'll become clear as I go. And the idea is that, of course, when we look at human societies, cities bring together almost all the problems and all the good things that we do socially. And so give you a lot of license to discuss a lot of the things that we already started seeing this afternoon in terms of models and ideas that pervade models, but also connect models and modeling in complex systems to a rich new sets of data that exist about people and about human societies and environments. And that really is where the frontier is in terms of our methods and our ideas. So let me start with maybe something that's obvious, but just to get us going. So this is the reason why, at least in policy and maybe at Ipea, people really, really care about cities. And I like to call it sort of the urban economic miracle. So what you see there is that on the x-axis, so you have different nations there in different colors. Brazil is purple, so look at Brazil because I'm about to tell you something about it. But on the x-axis, you have percent urbanized. So by some measure of the size of the smallest city, this is basically saying what's the percentage of people in that nation that live in cities. And on the y-axis, you have GDP per capita as a measure of wealth and development. It's not a perfect measure, but just let's start there, and I'll give you a few measures as I go later. But what you can see here is that basically urbanization, the fact that those lines are more or less diagonal, means that urbanization and economic growth and human development really go hand in hand and have gone hand in hand historically everywhere. So we really don't know how to generate human development and economic growth without cities. Cities are sort of the places, but also sort of the mechanisms, as you'll see, by which this happens. But when you look at Brazil carefully there, and I know the line ends in 2005, so it's a little bit early, you also see that Brazil is one of the most urbanized countries on that plot, but is also gone flat for a while. So urbanization in Brazil happened very quickly, and you know the circumstances better than I do, but there was a lot of migration in the 60s and 70s to cities. But it did not generate immediately economic growth. So that's something that Brazil's still struggling with, and you have some good periods and bad periods. But it's a good question as to what takes urbanization to also generate human development and economic growth. So today I'll try to give you at least some insights about that from complex systems, and also to give you some ways of thinking about policy that is connected to those processes. So this is now not Brazil, it's India, but it's just to have a measure of human development that's not necessarily about economic growth and GDP. What you see there is the cost of water supply and the amount of water supply in cities of different sizes. So basically, the point is that there are economies of scale. It's much cheaper, basically, to provide concentrated populations in cities with water supply than in places that are not so dense. And it's true even in a place that is struggling with development like India, to already do that to a much larger extent in cities, even including very large numbers of poor populations in Indian cities, than it is to do in the countryside. So in India, you see this very fast urbanization, and what's happening is that despite a lot of urban poverty, the conditions in cities are already better in many respects than they are in rural areas. This is the same thing for electricity. So I'll move on. But basically, this tells you that a lot of the policies for development are no longer rural policies. They're policies of cities. They're policies in urban environments. And so what does that mean? And why is this possible? Why is it cheaper? And when does it fail as well, is what I'll be talking about. So the chapter that I wrote for Ipea has these four chapters. First, I want to give you a certain sense of where cities as complex systems, this idea came from. It came both from fundamental ideas about cities and architecture and planning, but also came from need and experience and really policy and its failures. Then I'll tell you a little bit more about why cities are complex systems. That will echo a lot of what was said this morning, but it will be illustrated with examples from cities. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about what we know specifically about cities as complex systems. And finally, I want to spend some time telling you about what all these ideas mean in terms of strategies, not so much exact policies, but strategies for policies in cities. And you'll see that there are different kinds of policies, and that's very important to understand, and to understand when one kind of policy, it'll become clear what I mean later, or another kind of policy is adequate. Okay, so let's start basically with Brasilia. So this is not Brasilia yet, it's Paris. And if you are an architect, you know what this is. It's very iconic. It's Le Corbusier, and it's this plan for what Paris should look like Brasilia. What you see there are towers in the park, and those are, if you know Paris well, many of you might have been to Paris, that's the Marais. So it's one of the oldest parts in Paris, one of the great attractions, one of the most picturesque neighborhoods. But this is the idea. Corbusier was working on these ideas in the 20s and 30s. But this really was the idea of planning, grandmaster planning, in terms of total redesign of cities around certain concepts that were coming from very smart people, but they were very idealized. And in particular, they were very homogeneous, very simple, relative to sort of the texture and heterogeneity and the things that we already discussed this morning that you always see in cities. Cities are very, very diverse. And in some sense, these plans considered a city that should be healthy, that should have very high residential density within islands of low density. You know about Brasilia, so there it is. So you know all about this. But, you know, this inspired the building of several cities, mostly capitals. Brasilia is probably the ultimate sort of city of this period, of this sort of idea, sort of the modernist concept of what was a good city. But today you also have cities that look maybe more like this. So this is one of IBM's smart cities, so to speak. It's Masdar city in the Emirates. And it's a city that was meant to be, again, like Brasilia, designed from scratch on a patch of desert, and that would be completely self-sufficient in terms of energy and water and so forth, where all the technological systems, all the energy systems and water and energy generation would be integrated to be maximally efficient, where people would move around in these funny little vehicles that were electric and spew out purple rays, but that's not going to be built because it's expensive. But where the city would look a lot like a mall. So it doesn't tell you much about how people live, right? So that's part of the problem. Is that really a city, or is it just a fantastic, phenomenal, crazy engineering system? And that really is the tension that I'll try to maintain throughout the talk, and that will take us to policy. There's a certain sense at the end of the day that when you look at cities and when you look at policies, many of the policies that we pursue in practice, the things that cities do most of the time, are sort of engineering-like policies to deal with this sort of systems. But ultimately, really, what we want from cities is for them to work as socioeconomic systems. So how do we resolve that tension, and what does that mean both conceptually and for policy? Okay, so that's Tokyo. Tokyo is a wonder, that's from the 1980s, but you can see basically that that's basically the control room for Tokyo Underground. So it's for all the subway system, which is a marvel of engineering. It's really what allows Tokyo to be the largest city in the world, to have about 35 million people as a metro area. And this, of course, is Rio. You've seen this in the news. It's the control room for Rio. And it's not quite that, because, you know, it's a new system. It was built by IBM. It's one of their flagship projects. But, you know, there's a question, what is this going to be for? So a lot of what's being used for is to integrate a lot, again, of urban services and data. But it could also just be a massive surveillance program, right? Is that good or is that bad? So that's the problem of sort of the control room approach to running cities. Cities are not big factories, but they allow themselves to be systems that are run this way. But what can be run this way about cities? What should be run this way about cities, or not? And that's really the reason why I'm bringing this up, is that it's both a practical problem, but it's at the essence of what makes a city a complex system, or sometimes also a simple system. A simple system can be run this way. A complex system cannot be run this way. So I'll make that clear as I go. So let me just tell you again just a little bit more history, and then I'll move on to examples. So this is what happened in the first wave of the uses of data in big computers. You can see sort of what the big computer looked like in the 70s. And this was done by the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation systematized and modeled a lot of methods for enterprise management. A lot of those came from the war effort, the Second World War, and then they were used a lot in corporations in America. And by the 60s and 70s, they were being used, these methods basically, to quantify and rationalize the running of corporations and then cities. They were being used in cities. And New York City, as often is the case, was the pioneer. So this is in New York City. And they ended up, for a variety of reasons, running the New York Fire Department. That's why it's called the Fires. And for a variety of reasons, not just to do with these methods were used at a period of cuts. So there were cuts in the fire department. They used to also rationalize what should be cut. And what happened is that basically this happened. This is the South Bronx, and it burned down. So if you're familiar with the history of New York, you may not be. There were parts of New York that basically burned down or completely abandoned during this period. And in some sense, certainly this rationalized model management of things by the RAND Corporation, actually, if you read this book, shows you anecdotally what led to all those issues in nevertheless coming from a good idea and from a big computer. So what happens here, what you're seeing here is Jimmy Carter visiting, I think in 1976, visiting the South Bronx. You see in the background how those buildings are abandoned and they actually burnt down. And those neighborhoods are still poor, and basically that was a disaster where large parts of the largest city in the United States, a city that today is of the size of Sao Paulo, really burnt down. But at the same time, it's curious to see that in that picture, if you could look like 2 miles away from there, extraordinary things are happening. So hip-hop was just being invented at that time, something that really changed cities and the world in a way that this kind of management of cities didn't. So again, very, very complicated things, right? How do you deal with sort of the city of people, the city of services, the city of things, and how do you deal with it politically as well as conceptually? So it was out of these sort of big disasters of certainly in America, of American modernist planning, of infrastructural planning, that came sort of the reaction to start looking at cities as integrated systems, as socioeconomic systems of people, of economies, of firms, of other organizations, but also then